this episode of Lives on the Line, the podcast. Napa, California. This beautiful and historic city is not only known for its wine, but also some unsolved crimes. And some are infamous. I sit down with Sergeant Todd Shulman, former cold case investigator and author, to discuss some cases in his career. 4, 3, 2. Todd.
Yes.
How are you, sir?
Very good.
Good. Thanks for spending some time with us tonight. Appreciate that.
Yes.
So we'll jump right in. You're a police officer?
I am, yeah.
And where do you work?
I work in the Napa for the Napa Police Department.
Okay, so Northern California.
Yes.
Very nice. It's a beautiful area.
It's the wine country, so yeah, we definitely worst places to work, yeah.
Yeah, very nice. How long have you been there?
So I've been with Napa for 18 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Long time. Mm-hmm. And how's it going?
It's great. Yeah, it's like I said, it's a good place to work. There's a good group of people I work with. So, yeah.
Okay. What kind of assignments have you held in Napa?
So, like anybody, start off in the patrol bureau, working, pushing a car around. So I did patrol work for several years, and then transferred into our detective unit as a detective. And I was in there for a period of time. Started doing some crime scene work as an ancillary duty, and then went back to patrol. We have a rotation where you work for a certain period of time and then switch out. So then there was an opportunity that came up to be in a cold case unit. So I worked as a cold case investigator for several years under a federal grant that we had, and then came back to patrol most recently. A couple of years ago, I got promoted to sergeant, and so now I'm in charge of a team of officers working on patrol.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've done a lot.
It's been a good career. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
So you worked the cold case files, you said.
Yes. Yeah.
What kind of cases have you worked for the?
So the cold case thing was interesting because it was not just the police department; it was a county-wide effort. So it was through NIJ, National Institute of Justice, federal grant, and the specific focus was on DNA technology. And so it was myself and a sheriff's detective, and our job was to look at the 20-some unsolved homicides that we have in Napa County, update the case files, actually go into the evidence rooms and see what evidence we still had, what condition the evidence was in, and then see if we could use DNA technology to maybe make some progress on some of the cases, and look at them again with fresh eyes.
Sure.
So, yeah.
And this was your primary assignment, was to work these cases that have gone cold.
Right. Yeah. So, in the years past, because we're a small agency in a small county, officers, regular detectives they'd give you a case to work on in your spare time, some of these unsolved murders. But it's very difficult when you have a caseload of other things to work on those. So in this particular case, we got this grant which paid for my position as sheriff's detective for wound up being 2.5 years that we worked on these, and that was our only assignment, was just to look at these cold cases.
So over these 2 years, what kind of cases did you have an opportunity to look at and dive into?
It was a variety. We actually looked at several of our besides the homicides, we looked at some of our unsolved sexual assault cases that were long term, where we knew that there was sexual assault kits completed, evidence collected. And so we looked at a few of those, and then we looked at, like I said, there was about 25 unsolved murders in Napa County. The oldest one was going back to 1963, involving a 5-year-old girl that was murdered. So we went from that case all the way forward to the most recent case we looked at was in 2007. We had a homeless man that was killed that we never found the suspect. So it was a variety of cases. So all the way from the 60s, from that young girl that was killed, we looked at the Zodiac Case, which was made major headlines here in Northern California, and just more mundane cases where there was work done but never brought to completion.
Yeah, when I think of cold cases, I think of just homicide cases, serial killers, things like that. I never really thought about sexual assault cases, but in those, I suppose you probably can tie those into other homicides and things like that too. So it's really interesting.
Well, and a lot of those are, you wind up, the thought is that they could wind up being serial people that have committed serial crimes, like more than one offense. And so we wanted to make sure we had the DNA in the system for all these cases, the sexual assault cases that were unsolved, and then look back at the original files to see if we could maybe re-interview victims, re-interview witnesses, and make some progress on them.
So when you resubmitted some of the DNA, did you get any hits back for anything?
Yeah, we actually did. Part of the grant, which was really helpful to us, is we had a half-time criminalist at DOJ just working on our cases. Because that's one of the stumbling blocks that we've seen with some of our cold case work, is that the Department of Justice DNA lab is so busy with new cases and things that are currently happening that there's a long backlog to work on those. So in this instance, we got to use this person half-time just to work on our cases. And so we actually found 2 of the sexual assault cases where there was a suspect name, but they had never were able to get a DNA sample from them. They thought they knew who the person was, or the person was named by a victim or by a witness, but the kit was never connected with that person's DNA. And so we were able to go back and resubmit the evidence and get new samples from those suspects. And we were able to close two of the long-term rape cases that we had.
That's great.
Yeah. And it's really great in those cases to get closure, to be able to go back to the victim and say, okay, we know who this person is. And in one of the cases, we got a plea deal where he didn't even go to trial. He just pled no contest and took some jail time, which kind of speaks to the importance of DNA and getting a match in it.
Yeah. You mentioned the case from '63, the little girl. Mm-hmm. Did you get any additional leads or any new evidence for that case, or is it still unsolved?
Well, unfortunately, that one's still unsolved. But we did. We were able to go back in the original files. One of the interesting things about working these cold cases was to look back at the original reports, look at the what the officers did in those initial investigations, look at some of the notes they'd even kept around, to see who their suspects were, and then see if we could kind of look at those people, like what have they done since then, where are they at now. And so we did that with that case. We looked at some of the key suspects. We actually, part of the cold case project was putting out some information on a website where we listed all these cases. And that generated some new leads from people who still lived in the area that said things like, oh, my neighbor was acting really weird around that time, and we lived down the block from where this little girl lived. Maybe you should look at him. And so we were able to, follow up on some leads that we had never had before, as well as refreshing some of the leads that the detectives worked on, 50 years ago when they worked on the case. But unfortunately, like I said, none of those led to us arresting anybody. Mm-hmm. And because that was our oldest case, we dealt with some challenges as far as the evidence not being preserved properly. And it's really hard to get DNA on some of the older evidence. So, yeah. So
the evidence collection back then was obviously significantly different than how it is done now with the technology, like you said, and then also with, I'd imagine with like note taking, where everything is entered into a system or a database. Mm-hmm. Back then, it was just mostly notepads and old reports that were handwritten.
Yeah, it was really interesting for me because I'm an historian by nature, to look at some of these old reports. And literally there would be notepads in a banker's box, and then there would be a secretary that would type the detective's report. So he would write down notes, and then he would give it to a secretary or stenographer who would then hand type those things into a report, but not everything made it into the reports. And so one of the challenges with working these older cold cases is even some of the detectives that worked on the cases aren't around anymore. Unfortunately, several of them had passed away. And so then we're trying to do the best we can to look at the notes and interpret what they had in there. And so, yeah, it's a different process than today, when you can look on a electronic file or access the internet and look at reports and things like that. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned you're a historian. Mm-hmm. with Napa.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've always kind of been interested in history, like since I was a kid, and History Channel was, grew up watching those
Yeah.
shows. There's all kinds of neat things on there. But so when I got to the police department in Napa, I was there for probably maybe about 6 years, and then I just got this. I heard that the chief had scrapbooks that they kept in the chief's office with newspaper clippings, and so I thought, well, that's kind of cool. Let me go see what's up there. And the secretary opened his cabinet and pulled out these dusty scrapbooks that had been there for years. And yeah, literally for a period of 30 years, the chief secretary, the chief would clip out things that they thought were interesting, crime wise, or the police department was involved, and put them in these scrapbooks. And so I started reading some of the stories and got more interested in the history. And then I started contacting some of our former officers, some of the people who retired, and some family members of officers who passed away. And what really got me going on the whole process was I went down to San Diego. This is now 13 years ago. I was down there for a conference, a police conference, and the San Diego police have this really active history group down there. And they had an old police car in the lobby at the hotel we were at. And there was a gentleman there who was a San Diego police officer. His name's Steve Willard. And he's their department historian, so to speak. And he was instrumental in them starting a police history group down there. And he had just written a book about San Diego police history. So I picked it up and started looking at it. And I contacted Steve. And I said, hey, I'd really like to do something like this about Napa and about the Napa police history and Napa County law enforcement. And so he helped me out a lot, kind of giving me advice about the book. And then also, as I got a little farther in the research for the book, my thoughts expanded. And I was like, well, maybe I could start a history group here to help preserve what we're doing. Because in doing research for the book, I had relatives that they started giving me photos. They gave me like batons, badges, things like that. And I was like, we need to have somewhere to keep these things and preserve them so that they don't wind up disappearing, or, so that it can be enjoyed by people down the line.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the starting of the whole thing. And that was, 13 years ago.
And this led you to writing your first book, correct?
Right. Yeah. Like I said, Steve had done that book on San Diego, and it's through a company called Arcadia Publishing, which they do a lot of local history books about a multitude of history subjects. But he kind of mentored me through how to put the book together, gave me some suggestions on where to find photographs. And so that led me to putting this book together. And when I started looking at the history of the Napa police, I thought I need to do something about all of Napa County because we're a smaller county. And so the way the book wound up coming together was there's a chapter for each police agency in the county. So there's a history, there's a chapter about the sheriff, there's about the Napa police, about Calistoga, St. Helena, and even the CHP, because they started off as a county-run group before the state took them over. So the book came together like that, and we put it together in 2006, and that was kind of my first published book that I put together.
Nice. What was the name of the book? Or what's the name of the book?
It's called Napa County Police.
Okay.
And it was mostly photographs. So I would use the photographs that I found in the police department, mostly photographs from relatives and from retired officers. And then each photograph, I could have a little story with it to talk about why that photograph's important. So it's kind of like you hear the adage, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Mm-hmm. And so we picked photographs that were representative of each of those agencies and from different periods of the history to kind of tell the story of Napa law enforcement.
What were some of the stories that you found during your research that were really, really stood out for you?
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of them. For that first book, the one that really, the interesting thing for me was rediscovering some of the history that had kind of been lost over time because nobody was really keeping track of it. So before I kind of got involved in this, each agency might have kept some things in a drawer, or a lot of it was kept word of mouth, handed down from officers to other officers. And so in doing research for the first book, I wanted to find out about the first agency in Napa County, which is a sheriff, of course. and they were formed when California became a state in 1850. And so I went back and I found out that there was no known photo of the first sheriff. We knew who his name was, but nobody had kept a photograph. And even the sheriff's department didn't have a photograph. They have a wall of sheriffs when you walk into the sheriff's office, his little waiting room, but they didn't have a photograph of the first sheriff. So it was interesting to me because I was able to go to the state archives in Sacramento, in the state library, and was doing research there on just different history topics about Napa County. And I came across maybe when I was a kid, this is before the internet and electronic computers, they had the card files where you pull out the drawer and there's little index cards with all the different things in it.
Right.
And you go to the library. And they had one of those there. And sure enough, there was a name on there for Nathaniel McKimmy, who was the name of our first sheriff. And so I pulled it and gave it to the librarian and said, hey, I'd like to see what this is. And it turned out to be a photograph of him. And it's the only photograph we've ever been able to find of him. And it just so happened that one of his distant relatives donated it to the state library in the 1950s. And it probably had sat in a file somewhere there, maybe the whole time. Who knows who else had even known it was there. But it was neat to rediscover that and be able to take a copy of that photograph and use it in the book, but also be able to take it and give it to the current sheriff and say, here's part of your history. And now they have that photograph on the wall at the sheriff's department.
Yeah.
So.
And doing this first book, is this what this kind of snowballed into wanting you to do additional books after that?
Right. The second book about law enforcement I did, what happened was during the research for the first book, I started hearing all these stories that were interesting to me about some of the famous crimes that have happened in Napa, about the red light districts that were in the different cities in Napa, about the the history of different infamous murders, things like that. And so I had all these great stories in the back of my mind, and I thought maybe I should put that together in a book and tell more of the stories of some of these key cases in Napa history. And at the time, I had just gotten done with that cold case unit, so I was also thinking about the history that way. So I found another publisher, which was History Press. It's very similar to Arcadia. And I pitched the idea to them, like I'd like to do a history of Napa crime and infamous murders. And it turned out it was right along the lines of something they were doing in other places around the country. And it's a whole series of books they have called Murder and Mayhem. And so they said, let's do a Murder and Mayhem in the Napa Valley. And so that book I put together, it's been 4 years ago now. And it's some of those great stories we talked about, a little bit.
Now, one of the cases that you talked about before was a case at a restaurant bar in downtown Napa?
Right.
And that was back in the 70s?
Right. It was 1976. Yeah.
Okay. What happened with that case?
So that was, the bar was called Fagiani's.
Okay.
Back in this period of time in Napa, Main Street was lined with smaller bars and little restaurants. It was a place where working class people would come. There were some hotels down there that were like rent by the day hotels. So it's a place where lower income people and working class people would come and get a beer at the end of the day, where they would go downtown to have some drinks. It was not like anything you would see today if you went downtown, which is like full of wine tasting bars and high-end restaurants. So this was very much part of that era of the 60s and 70s where there were a bunch of these little hole-in-the-wall bars downtown. And Fagiani's was one of them that was very popular. It originally was owned by an Italian immigrant, and he had started in the 1940s, and then he had wound up passing away, and his two daughters, Muriel and Anita, had taken it over and kind of decided to keep running it. Now, at the time, both women were also working full-time jobs and had families, but they kind of shared the responsibility. They would come in and alternate working the bar at night, most of the time by themselves. Like one or the other would be there, sometimes both. And so that's kind of the backstory. Anita Andrews was one of the sisters, And her full-time job was actually working at the Napa State Hospital. She was a clerk there. But this was something she did because they were trying to carry on this bar, keep it in the family, and honor the memory of their father, because these girls had both grown up as little girls working in the bar, helping their father out. It was very much a family business. So she was working by herself this particular evening, and there were a normal group of men in there. Different people would come in, grab beers, leave. Very plain bar. Had one bar with some animal like deer heads, different taxidermy animals on the wall, a pool table, and some bar stools. That's about it. Very simple place. Just come in, get a beer, go home. And so this particular night, the patrons all were there. People gradually started leaving. And then nobody knew anything was wrong until the next day when Anita didn't show up for work at the state hospital. And her sister was contacted, like, hey, we don't know where Anita is. So Muriel, the sister, goes down to the bar. And unfortunately, she was the one that had to go in. And she was looking around looking for a sister and finds her sister in the back prep area. And she had been brutally murdered and sexually assaulted. So unfortunately, she had to be the one that found the sister. And so that was a big crime for Napa, having that happen right downtown.
Yeah. And just when I looked at the case, her car was gone also. Her car was missing. And initially, there were no leads as to who it was or what happened.
Right. Yeah, her car was gone. They put out a bulletin for that immediately. And so the detectives did what they could. This was before the era of surveillance cameras and things like that. So they just started tracking down people they knew were at the bar that were regulars and started interviewing people, trying to get an idea of who was there and who the last person was to see her alive, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so they started to get a picture of that. And they had one person in mind they thought might be involved because he had a lengthy criminal history. And that person stayed on the radar actually for decades. They thought somehow he might have done it. They interviewed him multiple times. He always denied it. And in this era, in the 70s, of course, there was no DNA technology. So they had to go by fingerprints. And sometimes if there had been blood found from the suspect, they could, figure out what blood type it is. But that's about all they could do. And if there was a presence of bodily fluids with sexual assault, the bodily fluids were there, but they couldn't tell who they came from. So the case was investigated as much as they could in the 70s, and her car never showed up. They interviewed everybody they could think of, and they just put it on the shelf because they couldn't get anybody to confess, and nobody, nothing tied anybody particular to the crime.
And there was something interesting about the bar too, right? The building itself.
Yeah. So Muriel, the surviving daughter, kept the business open for a couple months afterward, but then she just locked everything up as it was. And so this is actually for decades. The building stayed the way it was, the padlock and chain around the front door. And periodically, the different detectives that worked on the case would go in, and Muriel would let people go inside to look, and everything was set up exactly the way it had been. So all the bar stools, all the furnishings were there. The dead animals were still on the walls. All the liquor bottles that had been there were still on the shelves lined up.
Just frozen in time.
So frozen in time. And as Napa started to develop, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, it became even more apparent that something was wrong here, because all the other businesses around it were redeveloped, renovated, started to open up. The kind of flea bag hotel, kind of transient hotel that had been across the street was demolished, and a beautiful park was put in on the riverfront. So it really kind of was this anomaly in the middle of downtown Napa that never changed. And Muriel became a fixture at local city council meetings where she kind of became like a gadfly kind of person who would question everything about government and kind of always paid attention and always had a comment about anything related to government. In fact, they eventually put like a brass plaque on a chair there at the city council chambers with her name on it because she was a fixture there, literally. But it went cold for several decades, and nothing could be done on the case until just before we started the cold case unit. They started to do some work on it.
Okay, and eventually they did find somebody that was connected to the case. Right.
Yeah. So they had as I said, they didn't know about DNA technology and fingerprint. They knew about fingerprints and about blood types, things like that, for evidence collection. But they did have some cigarette butts that were collected at the scene, and they also had a rag that had some blood on it that was found at the bar. And so the detectives, a detective and a DA investigator working on the case, decided, let's submit these things and try to see if we can get DNA off of them. And so they did that, and it took a while because this was before we had this cold case unit, so it was a backlog. It was sitting there on a desk with a bunch of other things. But they eventually got a notice that there was a DNA hit. So that was a big surprise to everybody. And then it was a surprise when it turned out to not be the person that was the prime suspect, because there was this local guy who I mentioned earlier, and he had been always on the forefront, and then it turned out it was not his DNA. And so everybody's thinking like, well, who is this DNA from? Who is this person that popped up in the system?
And this was somebody who was already in custody in Colorado.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it turned out to be a guy named Roy Melanson. And the only reason we got the DNA hit was that he had been prosecuted for a brutal murder in Colorado, another cold case, actually, where he had finally been caught and gone through the court process, been convicted, and then he was serving time for that murder, and his DNA was collected. And so it's only because of that trial and conviction that we then got the DNA hit that we did on our case.
This is something recent, or correct me if I'm wrong, is this something recent that they started doing where they started collecting DNA from people that are arrested for certain crimes or already imprisoned, and then now they're going back and connecting that DNA? Is that
right? They continually are expanding the DNA database of known suspects, and so initially it would only be people that were convicted of certain crimes. Then it expanded to people that were arrested for certain crimes, and so I believe California has the largest DNA database in the state or in the country. And of course, we upload all of our information from California into the national database, which is CODIS. So, so all those unknown samples get uploaded. All the known profiles of offenders get put in there, and so there always are new hits being made because we're constantly getting more samples and more offenders added into it. Yeah.
So this person was convicted ultimately for the murder of Anita?
Yes. So they decided to extradite him back to California, even though he'd already was serving a life sentence for killing this other woman in Colorado. And so they brought him back, went through a whole trial process, which was challenging because all the witnesses now were, in their 60s, some in their 70s, the guys that had been at the bar just drinking a beer. All the detectives were also old, or one or two had passed away. And so you're dealing with people who are having to remember what happened to them, 40 years ago at that point. So it was a little bit challenging, but really the cornerstone of the case was the DNA evidence and putting that in front of the jury and explaining this person had literally no connection to Napa. So it wasn't like this guy was somebody who went in the bar every night and, his DNA would have been there. He was somebody that came into town, committed this crime and then left right afterward and never came back. And so it's one of those cases that we never would have solved without DNA because we had no clue who he was. We, never on the radar. None of the other people in the bar knew who he was, so his name was never brought forward. And so it just kind of shows you how important that technology can be.
Yeah, and it's one of those cases where you you find somebody who you think is going to be a suspect, and you focus your attention on that suspect, and keep re-interviewing, and it ends up being somebody completely different. And
Right.
and like you said, the importance of now and back then, the collection of everything in a crime scene, no matter what it is, cigarette butts, anything could be of importance.
Yeah, and even since I've been in law enforcement, which is now altogether 23 years, the technology has improved steadily even since the 90s on how much of a sample they need to get a profile. And so who knows what the technology will be in 20 or 30 years. So, we try to train our officers as crime scene people to be very careful how they collect the items, preserve them properly, and in the hopes that someday even something that we can't use today might be useful.
It's really interesting. I never thought of it that way. We're collecting evidence nowadays. You're not just collecting evidence for today. You're collecting evidence for potentially 20 years from now that can solve a crime. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
What were some of the other cases that you found while you're doing your research for the book?
Well, one historic case which I thought was really interesting dates back to the 1880s, and it involves a guy named Edward Muybridge, who is not a household name today, but was one of the people that was instrumental in a technology that we all take for granted. And his case came up. It was a classic love triangle. One of the things doing the research for this book I found is the themes for why people commit crimes really haven't changed over the years. A lot of times it's jealousy, it's money, it's those instincts that have been the reason people have committed crimes forever. So this crime was in the 1880s, and it involved this guy Edward Muybridge, who was an expatriate from England. He'd come over to San Francisco to reinvent himself. He was a bookbinder initially, where his family would ship books to America, and then he would put them in bindings and sell them for more money. And so that was original why he came to California. And he wound up getting in a very serious stagecoach accident where he was actually thrown from the stagecoach and was in a coma for a period of time, had a head injury. And afterward, he was recuperating, and he took up photography as a way to kill the time, so to speak. And he became very good at photography. And he specialized in landscape photography, which was a new thing that was kind of coming out. It was a new technology was being used. And he became really famous in San Francisco for doing landscape photography. He did some really great panoramic photographs of San Francisco that are really important now because of the 1906 earthquake where everything was destroyed.
Right.
He was one of the first people to photograph Yosemite Valley before people, like Ansel Adams and everybody else came down. And he was one of the first people to go into that wilderness and start photographing it. And so he was away from town a lot. He wound up marrying a much younger woman, probably 20 years younger than him, who was a photographic assistant in the photographic studio he worked at. So he had this younger woman, younger wife that was home alone. He would be traveling for work. And the couple wound up striking up a friendship with a guy named Harry Larkins. And he called himself Major Larkins. He also was British. He claimed that he had been in the British military in the Far East and had all these stories about, having a lot of money. And then his family lost it, and he came to California. And this is 1880s, so it's not like you can go and Google his name
Right.
and find out if he's telling the truth or not. So who knows, really? A lot of work has been done about him, trying to figure out who he really was, and nobody's been able to verify his backstory. But anyway, he was working in San Francisco for local newspapers doing kind of entertainment stories where he would go to the opera or go to different plays and write stories about them like a drama critic. And he became friends with the Muybridges to the point that he would come over for dinner at their house. And then later on, when Edward would go away for these photographic trips, he would let Major Larkins escort his wife to different events, to the opera and things like that. And there were these kind of murmurings around town, rumors that maybe there was an affair going on. They were both younger people, about the same age. And then the wife, her name was Flora, she wound up getting pregnant. And so initially, Edward Muybridge was happy. They have there's a great photograph in my book that I found of her. It's a pregnancy photograph where she's wearing this big, elaborate dress. You almost can't tell she's pregnant because they have the huge hoops on the dress. But she's posed next to a hanging bough of pears, so a bunch of pears that are hooked together. And my research, I didn't know what that meant, but my research, I learned that that's kind of a sign of fertility. Having a full bough of pears is a sign of someone being pregnant. So there's a great photograph of her in the book. Anyway, so she winds up having the baby. Edward suspects that they're having an affair. He basically tells Major Larkins, you need to get out of town. You can't talk to my wife anymore. I don't want to see you around. And Larkins decides, okay, maybe I'll take a break from being a critic and go somewhere else. So he actually came up to Calistoga, which is in the north part of Napa County. At the time, Calistoga was a big area for quicksilver mines. Quicksilver it's used like for thermometers, mercury.
Okay.
Yeah. So Calistoga, that area around there, was known for multiple mines doing that. So he came up to Calistoga and he was doing surveying for the mines, and totally changed the pace for him. And Flora was sent with the baby up to Oregon to be with her family, to kind of be away from things, along with a nanny that Muybridge paid for. So a year passes, almost 2 years, and then Muybridge all of a sudden gets into a dispute with this nanny about money. The nanny wanted more money. She didn't feel like she was getting paid enough. And Muybridge's like, no, I'm not going to give you any more money. And she's like, out of spite, she said, well, just so you know, Flora's still been talking to Colonel Larkins, and they've been writing letters back and forth to each other. And so this got Edward really upset, because he had specifically told Larkins, don't talk to my wife, don't communicate with her. And so he flew into a rage. And there's in the book, I describe it. He had a partner in a photographic business there in San Francisco. And the partner sees him go into a desk and grabs a pistol out of the desk. And he starts running out, grabbing his coat to go jump on the ferry. And the partner of his tries to stop him, tries to convince him, don't do this, come back, think about it, calm down. And he just would have nothing to do with that. And he ran out and jumped on the first ferry from San Francisco to get over to Napa or to Calistoga. So at the time, of course, there were no bridges across the bay, so that's the only way to get here.
Yeah.
So he takes a ferry to Vallejo, then winds up getting on a stagecoach that takes him up to Calistoga. He gets up to Calistoga. It's at the very later part of the evening. It's twilight. And he goes to a local livery stable and says, hey, I need to rent one of your horse and buggies. I need to go up to one of the mines. And the owner of the livery stable was very leery about that, especially because it's late at night. The guy doesn't know the area. But he allows him to rent the buggy as long as one of the stable hands could go with him up and drive the buggy.
Yeah.
So they start going up to this mine, and Muybridge tells the stable hand, hey, I've got a pistol here. He goes, okay, if I pull it out and test fire it, because I'm worried about bandits or, like robbers coming to get us. The younger kid says, okay, whatever, sure. So he pulls the gun out and makes sure it's working. And so the stable hand doesn't think anything about it.
Seemed normal.
Yeah,
for the time.
That happened. There were stagecoach robbers literally going around Napa County. And so they get up to the mine and they go to Muybridge tells the stable hand, stay with the buggy, I'll be back. He walks up to the mine foreman's house, and it turned out this is now night. It's now dark out. It's night, and there's a party going on in the house. He can hear people inside, having a good time. There's people inside drinking and gambling, and so he knocks on the door, and someone comes to the door, and he's kind of the shadowy figure because it's dark out. There's light coming from the house, and says, hey, I need to talk to Major Larkins. And so Larkins gets up from his card game and comes to the front door. And then Muybridge says something to the effect of, Major Larkins, here's the response from my wife or something, and then shoots him once in the chest.
Wow.
It's point blank range. And so he falls over dead at the moment he hit the ground. And then Muybridge walks into the house calmly, sits down on a chair and sits and just waits. And so all the party goers, of course, they're like, what just happened? You know, what's going on? So they call for the sheriff and they come up and wind up arresting him. And later on, Muybridge had said that he was surprised that they actually didn't lynch him on the spot, hang him right there. He thought he was going to get dealt with by the people there, but they took him to the county jail in Napa, locked him up. And what happened afterward is probably, I would say, the biggest trial of the 1800s for Napa County. I don't know if you call it the trial of the century, but for Napa County it was. It was covered, it was big because he was a famous photographer, but also Muybridge by this time had a friendship with Leland Stanford. And Leland Stanford, if for people who don't know, was one of the railroad magnates. He helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. He was very rich in San Francisco, socialite. He was the founder, of course, went on to found Stanford University.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So he was one of the richest people in San Francisco. And he and Muybridge had gotten friendly because Leland Stanford was a horse. One of his passions was horse racing and raising horses. And Stanford had a bet with some of his other millionaire friends. Stanford was convinced that at some point when a horse was galloping at a full gallop, that all of its hoofs left the ground. And his friends thought it was crazy. They thought that can't be. That how can a horse be totally off the ground, that much weight? And so they made some kind of bet. I don't know what the bet was. Maybe it was $1. Who knows? These guys are all millionaires.
Yeah.
So Stanford actually hired Muybridge. And what Muybridge did was he set up a long track and a bunch of cameras next to each other going down the track. And they were on with little tripwires. And so he set a jockey down at a full gallop on a horse. And as the horse passed, it would trip the different cameras. And so he wound up getting a series of like 20 or 30 images. And in one of the images, you could see the horse is completely off the ground. So, of course, Stanford was very happy by this point because he won his bet.
Yeah.
And became friendly and stayed friends with Muybridge. So that's kind of the backstory where Muybridge was like more than just a normal guy on trial. He was part of the upper crust of San Francisco society.
I've heard of that story before, but I've never heard of the murder story about that.
Okay.
But I've heard the horse story before, yeah.
The horse story, yeah. So he had done that for Leland Stanford already by this time this murder happened. And so it's a huge murder trial. There's correspondence that came in from L.A., from San Francisco, Sacramento, and they would wire daily updates about the trial to their newspapers, and it got published all over the country. And so the trial went on, and basically his defense was that because he had been in this stagecoach accident, that something wasn't quite right about him after that, and he had bad impulse control. And he brought in a bunch of business partners and people that knew him to say that he had a really short fuse, and that's just the way he was. So he never disputed that he shot the guy and killed him. There's a bunch of witnesses. So there was a huge trial. It goes on for weeks, and then at the very end, the jury winds up acquitting him, found him not guilty of murder. And the day after that, there was an editorial in the newspaper in Napa, basically, where the editor said, this will serve as a warning to anybody that would commit adultery that this is what you're going to get. So people were happy, really, that he got acquitted.
And is this the beginning of not guilty by reason of insanity kind of thing?
I guess you could say that, yeah.
Or what's the other defense when crime of passion kind of thing?
Right, yeah, where sometimes someone tries to get a lesser punishment, like a manslaughter, saying it was crime of passion. That's probably what someone would argue today. I don't think they had the manslaughter. That wasn't a crime at that point. But he was acquitted, and the reason people said they acquitted him was that, he was provoked into doing it because she was having this affair. And so they said, okay, it's fine, you can do that. So, and it's a good thing that he was acquitted because he wound up to do even more work on photography. And one of the things he came up with was he did more work on the series of photographs like he did of the horse, what he did was he created invented something called a Zopraxiscope, which is it was a circular disc where he would put all these photographs around it, and then he would spin the disc with a light inside, and you could look at it, and it would look like the horse was moving, like a motion picture, basically. And then he put all that inside of a wooden box with a viewing area where you'd put your head up and look at it, and it would look like you were looking at a motion picture because all these still images were spinning quickly in a circle. And he wound up doing a whole series of these, like one was with a boxer, like people boxing. One was a couple dancing and kissing, which was very risque for that period of time. And he actually opened up a building at the World's Fair in the 1890s where he actually put this all on display. And the whole building was just full of these Zopraxiscopes. People would come in and pay a nickel to see these things operate. And so a lot of people credit that as being one of the inspirations for Thomas Edison when he created the motion picture later on, which would wound up creating movies like we have today, that this was one of the inspirations for that. And so who knows, if he had wound up being in prison, we may not have had that inspiration and may not have the motion picture like we have today.
Yeah.
So
what eventually happened with the wife? Were they really seeing each other, or was it just something that the nanny just made up?
No, she had a bunch of letters that she had kept.
Oh, okay.
The nanny had some letters that she showed Muybridge, and the wife admitted that the baby was Major Larkin's baby.
Okay.
So after the murder, she did not want to be with Muybridge anymore, but he refused to divorce her. She asked several times to get a divorce. He refused to divorce her, and she wound up getting ill, very ill, about 2 years after this happened, and passed away. I'm still not sure exactly what the illness was. It could have been a fever or some kind of bacterial condition. It's not very clear in the newspaper articles why she actually died, but everyone said basically she was miserable after this incident and heartbroken and very unhappy, and that that was part of what played into her getting sick and then eventually dying. And then what happened was the baby, Muybridge didn't want to raise the baby, put the baby in an orphanage. He allowed the baby to keep his name, and later on he did several times visit this young boy, but didn't provide any other support besides that, and basically disowned the child besides letting him keep his name. So yeah, very sad story all around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very sad, very interesting story.
Yeah.
And like I said, I've heard one of the stories about the photographs before, but I never knew the backstory to it as far as the crime that occurred.
Yeah, and in doing research, the photograph that I have of Flora actually came from Stanford University. They have an archive of documents related to Edward Muybridge because of his connection to Leland Stanford. So they actually have some of his original photographs of the horse there, and they have photographs of his family. And that's where I was able to find the picture of Flora that we have in the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then once you completed that second book, you moved on to your third book.
Well, yeah, I did another book, which was a different type of history. It was focused on postcards.
Okay.
That's one of my other things I collect is postcards. And so the third book I did was all related to Napa history, but told through different postcards. And these go back to the turn of the century. Napa was always a kind of a resort destination for the Bay Area. This is before there was, easy travel with airplanes and things like that, and motor cars. So people in San Francisco, to escape, would come across the bay, come up to Napa. There were hot springs up in Calistoga, and it would be a very much a place to escape for the weekend or for an extended holiday and come to Napa County. And so there was all these postcards created because there was all these great resorts and places to visit. Napa had the State Hospital, which is an iconic old, it used to be called the State Asylum, huge building that was there. It was like a tourist attraction. And so, believe it or not, they had postcards made with the State Hospital on it.
Really? And it's still there, and it's still in operation?
The state hospital is still there, not the building that was
Okay.
originally there. The original building was this. It looked like a castle. It had spires. It was made out of brick and stone. It was very imposing, huge building, but unfortunately wasn't earthquake safe and wasn't up to code as far as air conditioning, heating. So in the 1930s, they tore the whole thing down and built new buildings, which is part of what's there now. But yeah, so the postcard history book was interesting because you can look at some of those places, see the photographs or the postcards, and like in the state hospital case, you can go there and see where that was. And even some of the resorts are still in operation, just under different names or different versions of them.
So this is the equivalent of Instagram back then, where they can send pictures of what they're doing or whatever wherever they're going.
Yeah,
So-
postcards were very much about it was about sharing where you're at.
Right.
It was around 1900, 1905 when postcards actually became popular because they figured out a way to put those images onto the card. A lot of them were actually colored by hand, so someone would have a black and white photograph, and then an artisan would come in and hand color it. And then later on, in the 30s and 40s, you could actually take a picture with your Polaroid camera or your Instamatic camera and get it attached to a postcard and send it to someone so it's more personal. And so right now I probably have a collection of about 600 postcards, all from Napa County. And so that was kind of the beginning of that, putting that book together. And so that was a completely different project, but again, along the lines of history and my love of history that kind of played into that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So are you working on something else now, a fourth book, or just concentrating now on your new position at the PD?
I am working on a fourth book, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The publisher of my Murder and Mayhem book approached me and said, would you do something else? That book was probably my most popular book. It's been reprinted several times now from the first printing, and it still is selling. It's on Amazon and all those, all the sites. And it's believe it or not, some of the wineries actually sell this in their gift shops because several of the stories actually deal with wineries where there were famous murders that happened. So the new book I'm working on is very similar to the Murder and Mayhem in that it tells stories, but I wanted to focus on the people that were involved in investigating these crimes. There have been some interesting characters over the years that have worn a badge in Napa County. And so the book focuses on different artifacts that we've collected over the years in our history group, whether it's a badge or that belonged to somebody, or a baton, maybe a set of handcuffs. So that's the starting point, will be a photograph of that item, and then we talk about who owned it, the officer that used it, maybe some of the cases they worked on. So it'll kind of be a history of the people that have, protected Napa County over the years.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Is there an actual, at this time, museum in Napa that has these things on display yet? Or is that something you're planning on trying to do?
It was something I'd love to do. If anybody knows where I can find a building for free in Napa with Napa Real Estate, let me know. I'm sure we can get my contact info out there.
Oh, yeah.
But no, right now, currently, we have some display cases at our police station. The police chiefs that we've had over the last, since I've been doing this, have been very supportive, including our current chief. And so we have a display case in the lobby where everybody comes in, a public lobby, that we have an example of all various badges from our history, some batons, some photographs. And then we have several other display cases inside of our building in a main area where people go through, stairwell area, kind of a waiting area. And in those display cases, we rotate different things through there. So every couple months, we'll do a different theme with it. Currently, we have a display of model police cars. So these are scale models of different police cars that we've used over the years at the Napa PD, going back to the 1960s and 50s. And so we have probably about 15 cars in there and a couple motorcycles that we put together with all the authentic markings, all the authentic colors, paint colors. And so they're kind of a representation of we call it the wheels of justice, that's what we call it. But just kind of, being in law enforcement, if you're on patrol, you spend a lot of time in your patrol car, and it's a big part of what you do. And having the right equipment, the right car, can mean the world to you. Having a reliable car and it's your mobile office basically.
Right.
You keep all your stuff in it. And today it's even more of an office with mobile computers and cameras and everything else that we keep in there. So that's the current display. We've done other displays focusing on our canine unit. We did a display about the history of our SWAT team. So we try to change it up to keep it interesting and keep people interested in the history. So
Okay.
I would love to have a museum though in the future. That's my goal. Yeah.
I'm sure you have a lot of artifacts and a lot of things from the past.
Yeah, I have a whole garage full of items that I've been collecting over the last 12 years we've been doing this. We have everything cataloged and note where it's at. But and then we also have two vehicles that we have as part of our history collection. We have a 1957 Ford that we restored a couple of years ago. It was really a community effort. We got a lot of volunteer work and donations to help us put that together. And then we have a 2000 Ford also, which was, doesn't seem like it's very historic now. I mean, we're only talking 18 years ago. But it was our last patrol car to have rotating lights as opposed to LED lights. It was our last car. It was our car that had the first computer terminal in it that we used. It was our car that had we completely changed our logo and our graphics on our vehicle after this vehicle. So it's completely different. If you saw the patrol cars we have today, you wouldn't recognize it. And someday it'll be an antique.
Are these cars that you take out during parades or festivals too?
Right. Yeah, we do. Especially the 57, because people really get a kick out of that one.
Yeah.
In fact, we just recently, just a couple weeks ago, had it in our annual Christmas parade in Napa, where we deck it out with, in this case, we had like a red nose on the front and some antlers, and but so we usually lead that parade. We're always in the front usually, and we also participate in this annual 4th of July parade in Napa, which is a big deal. And then we take it to car shows in the area. It's always very popular. People love getting their photograph taken with it. And then also every year we try to. We've missed a couple of years, but we've taken it down to Ripon. There's actually a big emergency vehicle show in Ripon every year in October. And that is the biggest show of its kind on the West Coast. And I think they have on average 125, 150 old police cars of different vintages there. A lot of them are owned by private citizens, believe it or not. There's a whole culture of people that like old police cars and want to own them. And then some of them are owned by departments, and then some are like mine, which is owned by our police history group. It's a separate nonprofit that we have.
And this group, is this comprised of just officers from Napa PD, or is it also from the SO and the other departments in the area, in the county?
Yeah, we have a mixture, because initially I started it off. I mean, the group is called the Napa Police Historical Society. So its initial focus was, and its mission statement is to preserve the unique history of the Napa PD, to honor former and current employees, and educate the public about the history of Napa law enforcement and Napa PD. But we've kind of expanded over the years because Napa is a small county, and a lot of the things we do interconnect with the other agencies. For instance, there have been, I think, 3 sheriffs of Napa County that started off as Napa PD officers and then went over, ran for sheriff, and got elected. And we've had a lot of officers that have come from the sheriff's department became PD officers, vice versa. Excuse me. So our main focus is the Napa Police Department history, but we've also expanded it to keep track of some of the other agencies. And so the history group is comprised of current people in the department. We have retired officers from Napa PD, but then we also have community members that are interested in history that support what we're doing, as well as some members of other departments that have joined us as well. So it's really open to anybody who's interested in the history and wants to help us preserve it.
That's great.
Yeah.
And you meet once a month, once every couple of...
We have one annual meeting that's, set in stone. Every June we have a meeting. But we also sponsor get-togethers for retirees.
Okay.
Usually one in the summer, one in the winter. And it's a way to help foster those relationships, keep people connected. Law enforcement is very much a family. And, you spend a lot of time with those people when you're working with them. And I found that, the retirees really appreciate an opportunity for everybody to get together. They reconnect, they update each other on their families, and then they start telling old war stories, which I enjoy listening to.
Oh, yeah.
Some of the stories are good, about how things were done back in the day. So we sponsor a couple of those events every year as well. And then we do a quarterly newsletter that we put out where we update. We have history articles in it. We update people on retirements. Unfortunately, we have a section for people that pass away where we talk about their history and how they connected to the department. And then we also have a website where people can go to where we push out updates and things.
Yeah, that's really important to let folks know, especially like you said, the retirees, to know that, you're still one family. They're not forgotten, even though they're not on the job anymore, and to get together and continue to share experiences with. It's really great.
Great. Yeah.
To go back to the book about the murders in Mayhem.
Great.
One thing I forgot to mention was I drove by that restaurant earlier today.
Okay.
And it looks like they're in some kind of construction. So did they end up selling that place?
Yeah. So the ending to the story, I didn't mention it earlier. Yeah. The Muriel, refused to do anything with it, kept it locked up for decades. And then at the very end of her life, I want to say it was about a year before she passed away, she finally decided she was going to sell it, and she sold it to a local developer that she knew had ties to the local community. And then probably 6 months before she passed away, the officers were able to let her know that we had the DNA hit and that we were going to prosecute him. So she was able to get some closure as far as the murder that way, and she had made the decision she was going to sell the place. So it got redeveloped initially. It was a high-end bar and restaurant. And the interesting thing is that they kept all the original bar stools, and they kept the bar. They just refinished it, the actual bar back. So I had a chance to go in there after it opened with my wife, and it's kind of surreal to have seen the crime scene photos where you see these bar stools, and then I realized this is the exact same stools that are here. So to sit on the bar stool there, it's kind of weird. You think, is this the stool where this guy sat maybe? Who knows? So it was open for about 2 years, and then I'm not sure why, but it wound up closing down. And now it's being redeveloped again into being a restaurant and bar. So.
Yeah, when I drove by, the doors were open, and there's people inside cutting and sawing things and doing whatever people do when they work on stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, the downtown area of Napa has really changed, even since I've been there in the last 18 years.
Yeah.
They did a lot of work with flood control downtown. Historically, Napa flooded a lot. Like at least every 10 years, there would be a major flood, and all of downtown would be underwater. So with this flood control work done, we're getting more businesses coming in. As I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of wine bars. We have a lot of restaurants that are geared toward tourism. So that's a hot property right there. It's right in the middle of everything. So I have no doubt that it'll be popular, whatever they open there.
Yeah, I used to go to Napa a lot a bunch of years ago, and it's really, really different now. I mean, it looks great. And there's so many new buildings, and even now they're still building new things out there. It looks spectacular.
Yeah, people used to bypass Napa itself and drive up valley to Yountville or Calistoga, St. Helena, or to the wineries themselves. But Napa made a conscious effort to draw in some of those tourists. And there's always a debate. There's a debate between, the people that want it for the locals, want the downtown to be like when it was, where you go to like Woolworths or go to, local places, versus bringing in the high-end restaurants, bring the tasting rooms. They've opened some really nice hotels downtown. And I think it's, we have to realize that we need to have a balance. Napa has really taken advantage of the tourism and gone full force with it. And we see it as a positive thing in the police department. It's nice to be out there and introduce people to Napa and the area. So,
one of the other crimes that you mentioned that was in the book was the Zodiac Killer, and that's actually something you even had an opportunity to work on for a little bit with the cold case file.
Right.
What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's we could talk about that for hours. I mean, that's a very interesting case, of course, and it's been, so much has been written about it, so much has been done about it. It's hard to know. A lot of people maybe are exposed to it because of movies they've seen, or some people who have lived in the Bay Area a long time maybe remember that. I would say that case, interesting thing about, for Napa's perspective, that happened in 1969. And so remember, we talked earlier about the younger 5-year-old girl that was abducted in 1963. This happened in 69. Those two cases, more than anything, really opened people's eyes in Napa that this is not a small town anymore. We're part of a bigger area, and we actually have crime, and you can't just leave your house unlocked. And it really woke people up to the fact that, this is going to be, there's crime here and things can happen. So that's the first thing I'll say about the Zodiac case. The Zodiac case, it fell under us because it was one of the unsolved ones. And that one was interesting because there's been so much work already done on the case. So we had to look back at the files. That one, we had multiple boxes of, leads that have been followed up on, things that had been submitted. In fact, during our time, we had a spreadsheet that was put together of people who had been, given, the name was given to us, like, look at this person, this might be a suspect. And I think when we stopped the unit, which was in 2013, I think 2014, we were up to like 250 names on that list, and that's just people that either contacted Napa County or contacted our unit, said, hey, you should look at this person because I think they did it because of X, Y, and Z. And so we kept a list of all those people. And then we had boxes and boxes of things that had been sent to us, sent to the Sheriff's Department over the years. But when people found out there was a cold case unit working on that case and others, we had people reaching out to us like you wouldn't believe. The interest in that case was far exceeded anything else we got as far as tips and leads. And so, boxes of people would send like binders of all of their work on the case and why they thought a particular person did it. A big part of the Zodiac case were the coded cipher letters that he sent to the Chronicle and other news outlets. And so people over the years have thought they've solved them and found different meanings in them. And literally every person you talk to has found something different in there. And I think that they can tweak it to match what their theory is. It seems like.
So even as you got into the case, and probably maybe even now, there's still leads that are coming in for that.
I still get calls with people still thinking that we're part of the unit, and that now it's been 5 years since I worked on the case. And then some people just send a letter knowing that it happened in Napa. They'll send it to the Napa Police Department. When the crime actually happened up by Lake Berryessa, which is part of the sheriff's jurisdiction. But they think Napa Police because what happened was the crime happened in Lake Berryessa, and then what the guy, the killer, called the police department in Napa to report the crime.
I see.
And he used a payphone in Napa to call the police department.
Okay.
So he drove from Lake Berryessa down into Napa, which is about a 15-minute, 20-minute drive, and uses a payphone downtown to call our police department. At the time, we didn't have dispatchers working 24 hours a day. This was at night. So an officer answered the phone and is listening to this guy say, I've killed somebody. They're up here. This is where they're at. And so the call was reported to our police department and came in downtown. So I think people see that and they think, we have a connection to it, even though technically it's the sheriff's department's jurisdiction. So we still get things in the mail. And there are whole websites devoted to conspiracy theories.
I've seen those, yeah.
Yeah, there's a bunch. And we actually, my partner and I on the cold case unit subscribed to a few of them. just to keep track of what was going on and what people were saying. Because some of it's very compelling. Some of it, these people are not, they don't all sound like they're totally off the wall. A lot of these are respected people. They're academic people. They were specialists in different things, whether it's ciphers or whether it's, psychology. So some of these people, you think, look, that sounds good. So we followed those things, and then I'll have to say that a lot of the suspects that we wound up getting were from people saying, well, I think it was my, stepfather because he was really mean to me when I grew up, and we lived in the neighborhood where this one victim lived or something. Or, he was a biker Hells Angels guy, and I think that he was violent and he could have done that. And he had a crew cut, which matches the one sketch is of a guy with a crew cut. Or he wore, he was in the Air Force and he wore horn rim glasses, which the guy in the photograph has horn rim glasses, which were issued to people in the military. So everybody in the military had them. So we have a lot of, and of course, all these suspects usually have passed away. So we got a lot of leads like that. And in the case, we actually got to, we did talk to the surviving person from the Napa attack. So the Zodiac attacked multiple people. He attacked several people in Vallejo, Solano County. And then he attacked a young couple that was up Lake Berryessa, and he stabbed them brutally. And the girl, Cecilia Shepard, passed away. The boyfriend, male friend, Brian Hartnell, survived. He was very lucky because what happened was there was some boaters, some fishermen that were on the lake, and they heard him crying for help after the attack. And they were on the shoreline, and the boaters were able to come over, find them, and then reported it to the ranger station. So if those boaters hadn't been out there, he probably would have died up there and up at the lake also. So we were able to talk to him. He's a lawyer, works in San Francisco. He was gracious enough to sit down with my partner and I and talk to us about the case. And we had, all the records on his interview and, of course, the crime scene photos. And so even just to talk to him and get his perspective now that it's been 40 years later was interesting.
Is this where the sketch came from? That crime scene?
Right. Yeah. And the sketch, it's one of the sketches one of the pictures on the front of my book. It's actually the sketch a sketch artist was brought in to the hospital while Brian was still recuperating. And he, talking to the sketch artist, that's how that sketch came about. Mm-hmm. So that's the one that a lot of people associate with the hood and having the Zodiac symbol on the front. And then the other sketch that's famous in the case is the one that was from San Francisco, with the guy with the horn rim glasses and the crew cut. And that was done with SFPD officers who may have run across him not knowing he was a suspect at the time. Then later on, they did a sketch with those SFPD officers.
So when you were involved with the case, the other crimes that happened, like the one on Lake Herman Road, were you still involved with that scene as well, just because it all fell under the same suspect?
Well, we tried to do as much as we could to figure out if those other cases had DNA evidence that we could submit, since we had this pipeline of a criminalist working with us at DOJ. So we did go and talk to the investigator that was in charge in Solano County and in Vallejo, and we went to see what evidence they actually still had. And we talked to an inspector at the SFPD that was in charge of the Zodiac case at that point. And they get even more leads than we had. They had literally a room, probably a 10-foot square room, stacked to the ceiling with banker boxes full of things people had mailed them, theories and, binders full of stuff. So we reached out to those agencies to see, did they have anything that we could submit for DNA? And we did talk to them and had some items in our case that we submitted. Unfortunately, we didn't get a match. Still an unsolved case.
What was it about that case, do you think, that made it so, and even now makes it so popular?
Well, I think it's just the mystery behind it and how he taunted the police with those ciphers, the coded letters, very much in your face, flamboyant kind of thing. and that it was he was attacking young people that were just out having a good time. His victims in Lake Herman Road and Vallejo and in Napa were young couples that were starting out life, and they attacked them brutally, had no connection to them, so completely random acts as far as we could tell. And even the cab driver that he attacked in San Francisco was, again, as far as we could tell, completely random. So I think it's just the randomness of it, and the fact that he put himself out there and tried and garnered the attention by contacting the media and taunting and claiming even more murders than maybe he actually did, got people's attention.
So he sent these letters to the police department, to the news outlets, and there's only a handful of victims that we know of, but there could potentially be more from him.
Yeah,
some of the theories are out there right now.
Yeah, there's all kinds of theories that there are people that have tried to connect him to murders in Southern California, and there are other suspicious murders that happened around that time period. The only ones that I think law enforcement feels confident are the ones from Lake Herman Road, the ones in Vallejo, the one at Lake Berryessa, and the cab driver in San Francisco. There are other ones that are theories that he's connected and have similarities, and there were letters that allegedly came from him. But those are the core ones that we believe for sure he committed. And the interesting thing about the Zodiac case, one of the things that always piques people's interest is, why did he stop doing it? As far as we could tell, he stopped committing the crimes because there were no more letters sent that are verified to be Zodiac letters. There were no more crimes that were committed that were like those. And so that's always been the big question in everybody's mind, like, why did it stop? It seemed like he was committing these pretty regularly, and it was part of his MO, part of his what excited him, it appeared like, was taunting the police and getting the attention. So why did that stop?
What was that window that this all happened at? I mean, was it a couple of years that this all?
Yeah, it was. I believe it started in '69. I think it was '69 to '71
Okay.
is the time frame. So we're talking about 2 years. But it was again. I mentioned how that this crime was a wake up call to Napa. One of the letters he sent, taunted the police and said, "I'm going to follow a school bus and start picking off the kids when they get out of the school bus." And so because they, had a strong belief this guy was crazy and could do anything, they actually had police cars following school buses around. And I talked to several people in Napa that have been there since this happened who remember as kids having police cars following them to make sure they made it safely to school. So that's a big time wake-up call for a small town like Napa to have to do that. Yeah.
And you don't see these kind of, or at least I don't, maybe I'm not paying attention, but you don't see these kind of large-scale crimes that are occurring now. And I think maybe because of the advent of the technology of the DNA and everything else, where they're catching these folks before they get into multiple homicides or abductions or something. So
yeah, I think the advent of DNA and other crime scene technology has helped, and the information sharing that goes on with law enforcement now is greatly improved. Back then you could send a teletype maybe, or type up a bulletin and mail it to people. Whereas today we can log into our computer, we can send a quick email that gets blasted out to regional areas depending on where we want to send it. And it's very quick to get information out. In fact, I was mentioning to you before the podcast that the Zodiac case was one of the reasons why they started a statewide homicide association, a group of detectives, because they had detectives from the Bay Area that went down to Southern California to look into some of those cases. They realized they needed to have a way to share information and to keep in touch. And so they started the California Homicide Investigators Association, and now it's going to be celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. So,
and this is all networking and information sharing and
right, yeah, and it's a way to keep up. They publish like an association address book. So if you have a crime that occurs in another area where you think is connected to a different area in the state, you can look up, okay, who's a detective in that city? Let me call that person first because I know they're going to be somebody I'll be able to reach.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now that the cold case unit is, they stopped the funding for that, correct?
Right. Yeah.
So, but there's still, like I mentioned, there's still probably information coming in. Who works the Zodiac Killer case now?
Yeah. So now it's assigned to a sheriff's detective.
Okay.
When the reports come in, if I get something sent to me, I forward it to that person, and they're keeping that spreadsheet going and updating the case as they get it. But yeah, it's that's one of those cases where I don't think it'll ever be definitively closed or solved until we find like a murder, like a weapon that's tied to one of the murders, because they do have shell casings from a couple of the shootings. So if you found a gun in someone's attic and we could link it to those shell casings, or like the taxi driver that was killed, a couple pieces of his shirt were cut out, and one of them was actually sent to the Chronicle with blood on it, but there's still a piece of his shirt missing. So if you find a piece of the taxi driver's shirt, that'd be pretty good evidence that that person was involved.
Yeah.
But short of that, or finding a DNA hit, I think, we'll never be able to definitively say, yes, this person was a Zodiac and close the case.
Or with new technology in 10 or 20 years from now, they can really re-examine these pieces of evidence, then maybe then.
They might be able to, yeah. Yeah.
So what's next for you? Besides you've got a fourth book that you're working on.
Right.
What else is going on?
Well, I'm still working patrol at the police department, so that takes up a big part of my time. I'm working on a shift where I work with a lot of younger guys, which is interesting to me, supervising new officers that have been on the force for 2-3 years. They have a passion. They really want to go out there and learn. They want to work. And so for me, it's actually kind of reinvigorating to work with those guys. I learn from them. Hopefully they learn a little something from me. And so I'm doing that, and I'm enjoying that. I would love to get back into being in the investigations unit. As a supervisor now, since I was promoted to sergeant. So I would love to get in there, because I feel like I spent total of about 16 years, or now 15 years, in the detective unit. So it's something I have a passion for. I feel like I'm good at what I do in there, and I'd love to go in there and work with the detectives in that unit.
Any advice or anything you want to give out to any young investigators out there?
A lot of the work of a detective really hasn't changed since the stuff, these early cases. It's about following up on leads and just being persistent, and about being a student of people. A lot of the cases I solved were just about sitting across from somebody at a table and getting a feel for who they are and listening to what they say. It's something that you don't get when you read a report, like a written report, or even listening to an audio tape of somebody. There's whole courses taught on body language and how to detect things. But I think it's really true that that's where you really can see if someone's telling you the truth, if they're covering something up. So it's, I would say, just use your instincts and be persistent on cases. Hopefully, in our agency, we had a little bit of luxury because there's not a high crime rate in Napa. So when we get a case, we were able to work it and put a lot of time into it and keep it open for a period of time. And so I know some agencies don't have that luxury. They have to work their cases and then close them and move on to the next one. So I would just say, do the best you can on the case, follow up all the leads, and really pay attention to who the people are involved. Not only the suspects, but if your person is a victim or a witness, those people can be important too to getting you to where you need to go.
I spoke with someone, another investigator, who mentioned the importance of I guess not putting all your eggs in one basket. And he mentioned a case that he worked where they focused a lot on one person of interest and put all the resources into that person, and it ended up being somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So trying not to fit a square peg in a circle whole, I guess. Don't just put all your effort into this one person because you've already put so much time into it, but expand your investigation was one thing you mentioned to me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You don't want to have tunnel vision. And, there may be a lot of leads pointing to that person. You may have evidence even. But, it's always better to rule out anything else. It's better for the case when you get to trial to say you did that, because it's always going to be the argument is, well, you already prejudged my client and you already were convinced they're guilty and you did things to make that true. And so it's always good to keep an open mind and, eliminate other possibilities so that if that is the right person, that it's an even stronger case.
Yeah. And like we mentioned earlier, the collection of evidence and every little thing you can is extremely important. Even if you get a confession, having that evidence is going to be extremely important in the case.
Yeah, confessions are good, but they're not the end-all, be-all, because there's always arguments made that it was coerced, or that person didn't know what they were saying, or they were bullied into it, or they are crazy and really believe they did it, but they didn't. So if you can back up that with physical evidence or with witnesses and put everything together, I've always believed try to submit the strongest case you can to the prosecutor so that you don't have, the good case is if you don't have to go to trial. It shows you put work into it and that the person realized, okay, I can't fight this. I'm just going to, take a deal, or I'm going to, it's not worth it to try to go to trial on this. And so for me, it's kind of been, I look at it as a positive that I haven't done a ton of jury trials because a lot of those cases, I feel like I put a lot of effort into them and worked with the DA even during the investigation process so that we got everything covered we needed to. And for the cases I've worked, which are homicide cases, I worked a lot of sexual assault cases in my career, child molest cases. You really don't want to put those victims through a trial if you don't have to, because a lot of times that can be very traumatic for them. So I always felt if I could get the case in a winning format when we submitted it, that would be good for the victim as well.
Well, anything else you want to add or you want to say?
No, if people are interested in the history, they can. Both the books we talked about are on Amazon.
Yeah, we'll put a link. We'll put a link in the box there for people to take a look. What are the names of the books again?
So the first book is Napa County Police, and it's published by Arcadia Publishing. And the other book is Murder and Mayhem in Napa Valley, and it was published by History Press. Also, if people want information about the Police Historical Society, we do have that website. It's napapolicehistory.org.
Okay, and I'll put that in the...
Or, I'm sorry, .com, napapolicehistory.com.
.com, okay.
And we update that periodically, and we're always looking for people who support history. If anybody wants to either donate to us to help us support our mission or become a member, we'd be glad to welcome more people.
Very, very interesting stuff. Thank you, Todd.
All right.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for your service to the citizens of Napa. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, that's it.
All right.
How was that?
Not bad.